Every story has a moment that changes everything. And today, we're about to discover it. Before we begin, comment below if you've ever been judged before somebody even knew your name. And subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Welcome to Mr. Obama Stories, where stories don't just get told, they come alive. This is the home of powerful American stories, stories of struggle, success, mystery, history, and the unforgettable moments that shaped people, communities, and dreams. From inspiring life journeys to shocking real events, every story here is crafted to make you think, feel, and see the world differently. At Mr. Obama Stories, we believe every voice matters and every story carries a lesson. Whether it's motivation, history, real-life drama, or untold experiences, you'll always leave with something unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let the story begin. Because here, every story has a meaning, and every meaning has a story. Subscribe and become part of the journey. Chicago looked cold that morning, not because of the weather alone. The city itself carried pressure. Pressure in the train stations. Pressure in crowded elevators. Pressure in the way strangers avoided eye contact while standing inches from each other. Downtown Chicago especially felt like a place where weakness got exposed quickly. Rain slid down the sides of glass towers, while black SUVs crowded the streets below. Men in expensive coats hurried through intersections carrying coffee and stress in equal amounts. And standing above all of it was Black Ridge Financial, tall, sharp, impressive, the kind of building people entered carefully because careers were built there every single day, and destroyed there too. Inside the lobby, everything smelled expensive. Fresh marble floors, dark roasted espresso, luxury perfume, money. The giant gold company logo reflected against polished walls, while employees moved quickly through security checkpoints with the confidence of people who believed they belonged there. Keisha noticed all of it the second the revolving doors turned behind her. She paused for half a second near the entrance, not out of fear, out of preparation. Her fingers adjusted the strap of her leather bag while she looked toward the elevator doors ahead. Navy blazer, black slacks, small hoop earrings, natural curls pinned neatly back, professional, simple, controlled, but her eyes told a different story. She was nervous, not weak nervous, just tired nervous. The kind people carried after spending years walking into rooms where they had to prove themselves before even saying hello. Keisha exhaled softly and approached the reception desk. The receptionist barely looked up. "Can I help you? I'm here for the 11 o'clock strategy meeting." That got attention. The woman's fingers stopped typing. Her eyes lifted slowly toward Keisha. One quick glance became a longer one, measuring, calculating. Keisha recognized that look immediately. Everybody who grows up fighting for opportunities recognizes it eventually. The receptionist forced a polite smile. "Okay. Name?" "Keisha." The woman typed something into the computer, then frowned slightly. Another pause. Keisha stayed calm. "I was personally contacted yesterday." The receptionist kept typing. "Well, I don't see you listed here. That can't be right. Maybe whoever invited you forgot to finalize it." Probably. Keisha hated that word. Probably usually meant somebody already decided the conversation wasn't important enough to continue. Still, she kept her composure. "I can show you the email confirmation." Before the receptionist answered, a deep voice interrupted nearby. "Problem?" Keisha turned and immediately understood why the receptionist straightened so quickly. Mark, tall, broad shoulders, dark charcoal suit tailored perfectly, expensive watch resting beneath his cuff. Calm expression, controlled posture, the kind of man who looked completely comfortable in powerful spaces. He walked toward the desk while scrolling through messages on his phone. "What's going on?" he asked. The receptionist lowered her voice slightly. "She says she's here for the executive strategy meeting." Mark finally looked up fully. His eyes landed on Keisha and paused, just briefly. But Keisha noticed that moment, that quick mental judgment. Does she belong here? People thought those moments stayed invisible. They didn't. Mark slipped his phone into his pocket slowly. "And your name?" "Keisha." No last name, no explanation. Just calm eye contact. Mark nodded once. Who invited you? I was instructed to report directly to the executive floor. By who? The tone changed slightly now, less curious, more skeptical. Keisha felt irritation crawl quietly into her chest, not because of the question, because she already knew where this was heading. I have the confirmation email. Mark glanced toward the elevator, then toward the crowded lobby. Busy morning, executives moving everywhere, his patience thinning. Finally, he sighed softly. You've got 45 minutes to leave, he said flatly. After that, security gets involved. Silence. The receptionist froze immediately. A man near the elevators slowly looked away, pretending not to hear. Even the security guard nearby shifted awkwardly. Keisha stared at Mark quietly. Not embarrassed, not emotional, just disappointed. And somehow, that expression unsettled him immediately. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said calmly. Then clear it up quickly. Cold, professional, dismissive. Keisha folded her hands together slowly. You didn't even ask why I'm here. Mark gave a short, dry smile. I asked enough. That landed hard, because both of them understood exactly what he meant. Keisha looked at him for another second, then nodded once. All right. No argument, no scene, no raised voice. And honestly, that bothered Mark more than anger would have. Most people fought back when embarrassed publicly. Keisha simply turned and walked toward the seating area near the windows. Gracefully, calmly, like she refused to let anybody pull her out of character. Rain rolled down the giant glass panels behind her while downtown traffic crawled through the streets outside. She crossed her legs quietly and opened a notebook from her bag, like she still belonged there. Mark watched her longer than he meant to. Something about her composure irritated him. Not because she looked arrogant, because she looked unaffected, and he couldn't understand why. Upstairs, the executive floor buzzed with tension. Assistants moved quickly between offices carrying folders and tablets. Phones rang constantly. Market reports flashed across screens mounted inside conference rooms. Normally, Mark thrived in this environment. Pressure sharpened him. But today, something kept distracting him. Her face, that disappointed expression. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. Mark sat through 2 meetings, barely hearing half the conversation. One executive discussed acquisition percentages. Another complained about investor timing. Still, every few minutes his mind drifted back downstairs, back to the woman sitting near the lobby windows. He rubbed his jaw once and looked toward the conference room glass absent-mindedly. Why was that bothering him this much? He'd dealt with unauthorized visitors before. People lied constantly trying to gain access to executive meetings. So why did this feel different? A younger associate continued speaking beside the presentation screen. Mark didn't hear a word, because somewhere in the back of his mind, something uncomfortable had already started growing. Doubt. And downstairs, Keisha remained seated quietly near the rain-covered windows while the city moved around her. Most people argued when embarrassed. Keisha just sat near the window like she still belonged there. Keisha stayed near the window quietly after Mark walked away. Outside, rain streaked across downtown Chicago, while taxis crawled through traffic below. People rushed across sidewalks carrying umbrellas that barely protected them from the wind. Inside Blackridge Financial, the lobby remained warm, polished, controlled, but Keisha could still feel the embarrassment sitting heavily in her chest. Not fresh embarrassment, familiar embarrassment. That was the exhausting part. Nothing about this felt new. She leaned back slightly in the chair and checked her phone again. 3 unread messages. One from her cousin asking, "How's the interview going?" Keisha almost laughed at that. Interview. If only she knew. Another message came from her church group, reminding volunteers about Saturday's food drive on the South Side. Then she saw the message from her grandmother. Walk with grace. Don't let anybody pull you out of character. Keisha stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than necessary. That woman always knew. Always. Growing up on the South Side of Chicago taught Keisha lessons early. Some people judged you before hearing your voice. Some people decided your value before learning your name. And some rooms demanded proof from people who already earned their place there. Still, her grandmother never allowed bitterness inside the house. Not once. Keisha could still remember Saturday mornings growing up, old gospel music playing through the apartment, while breakfast filled the kitchen with the smell of butter and cinnamon. Her aunties arguing loudly over card games. Her cousins running through hallways, while somebody yelled about shoes on the carpet. Love lived loudly in her family. Even during hard years, even when money barely stretched far enough. Keisha smiled, faintly remembering it. That upbringing shaped her more than any corporate office ever could. Her family taught her dignity before ambition. That mattered now more than ever, because honestly, part of her wanted to leave, not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. She was tired. Tired of constantly walking into spaces where people searched for reasons she didn't belong. Tired of proving herself before conversations even started. Tired of being calm for everybody else's comfort. Her fingers tightened slightly around her phone. For one dangerous moment, humiliation almost won. Then she inhaled slowly, straightened her posture, and stayed seated. Upstairs, the executive conference room buzzed with tension. Senior executives filled leather chairs around a massive glass table, while presentation screens glowed across the walls. Quarterly projections, expansion strategies, investor concerns. Everybody looked prepared. Everybody, except Mark. He sat near the center of the table, pretending to focus on financial reports, while his thoughts remained somewhere downstairs near the lobby windows. One executive continued speaking confidently about Midwest expansion projections. Mark barely heard him. That woman's face kept replaying in his head. Not angry. That was the problem. Most people reacted emotionally after embarrassment. Keisha hadn't. She looked disappointed instead, like she expected better from him. And somehow, that bothered Mark more than confrontation would have. His assistant leaned closer quietly. Someone from New York just arrived. Mark nodded absent-mindedly. Then the conference room doors opened. Everything changed immediately. 3 sharply dressed executives entered first. Then an older man walked in behind them. The room stood instantly. Every single person. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, because everybody recognized him. The founder of Blackridge Financial, a man powerful enough to silence rooms simply by entering them. Mark straightened immediately. This visit had not been scheduled. The founder greeted a few executives briefly before placing a folder on the conference table. Then he looked around once. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "where's Keisha?" Silence. Complete silence. Mark frowned slightly. Several executives exchanged confused looks. The founder glanced around again. Keisha should already be here. Mark felt something uncomfortable shift in his stomach. Cold. Sharp. His voice came out more careful now. "What exactly is her role in today's meeting?" The founder looked directly at him, and suddenly, Mark understood. He had asked the wrong question. "She represents the investment group funding this expansion." Silence deepened. One executive lowered his pen slowly. Another man blinked twice like he misheard something. Mark felt heat rise behind his neck. The founder continued calmly. "She'll be deciding whether this Chicago division receives approval moving forward." Mark's stomach dropped. Hard. And then came the sentence that completely destroyed him. "She's also my goddaughter." For a moment, Mark genuinely forgot how to breathe. The lobby replayed instantly inside his head. Her standing at the desk. His tone. The assumptions. "You've got 45 minutes to leave." Oh God. The founder looked around the room again. "So where is she?" Nobody answered. Because suddenly, everybody understood the problem. Mark stood so quickly his chair rolled backwards slightly against the floor. "I'll go get her." The founder's eyes narrowed just slightly. That was enough. Enough for Mark to know the older man already understood something had gone wrong. Mark walked toward the conference room doors quickly, then faster once he reached the hallway. His heartbeat hammered harder with every step toward the elevators. By the time the elevator doors opened downstairs, panic had fully settled into his chest. The lobby looked exactly the same. Rain outside. People moving through security. Phones ringing softly nearby. But this time, Mark noticed something different. Keisha was still there, still seated near the windows, calmly reading through her notebook. Like none of this chaos had touched her externally, and suddenly, Mark saw everything differently now. Her composure, her restraint, her dignity, even after he humiliated her publicly. For a second, he simply stood there staring, because shame hit differently once arrogance disappeared. Keisha looked up slowly from her notebook. Their eyes met. Mark opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For maybe the first time in years, words failed him completely. Keisha closed the notebook carefully and stood. No smug expression, no revenge in her eyes, no satisfaction, just calm. "You came downstairs fast," she said softly. And somehow, that made him feel even worse. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Rain slid quietly down the giant windows behind Keisha, while the morning crowd continued flowing through the lobby, pretending not to stare. But people were staring. The receptionist suddenly looked terrified of eye contact. Even the security guard near the entrance found something very interesting about the floor. Mark swallowed once, hard, and for the first time in a very long time, he had absolutely no control over a situation. Keisha stood calmly holding her notebook against her side while looking directly at him. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just patiently, waiting. Mark cleared his throat. "Miss Keisha, it's all right," she interrupted softly. That somehow made things worse, because mercy felt heavier than anger. Mark rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "No," he admitted quietly. "It's not all right." Keisha studied him for a second, then glanced briefly toward the elevators. "The founder's waiting upstairs, isn't he?" Mark blinked slightly. "How did you know that already?" Keisha gave the smallest smile. "Because people only run downstairs like that when money gets nervous." That almost made him laugh. Almost. Instead, he exhaled slowly through his nose. "He's waiting for you, in the executive conference room." Keisha nodded once. Neither moved immediately. The silence between them stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable again. Finally, Mark said the words he clearly wasn't used to saying. "I owe you an apology." Keisha looked directly at him. "You do." Straight answer. No softening, no protecting his ego. And strangely, Mark respected that immediately. Most people around him spent their entire lives adjusting themselves carefully around powerful men. Keisha didn't. She respected honesty more than comfort. Mark nodded slowly. "You're right." The receptionist looked shocked hearing him say it out loud. Mark noticed. Honestly, that embarrassed him too. He gestured toward the private elevators. "Can we go upstairs?" Keisha walked beside him calmly. Not behind him, beside him. That mattered more than either of them said aloud. The elevator doors closed softly once they stepped inside. Smooth jazz floated quietly through hidden speakers overhead, while the city disappeared beneath them floor by floor. Mark loosened his tie slightly. For some reason, the elevator suddenly felt too warm. "I made assumptions," he admitted. "Yes." Another direct answer. He gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "You're not going to make this easy for me, huh?" Keisha looked forward calmly. "Were you planning to make it easy for me downstairs?" That landed immediately. Clean, accurate. Mark lowered his eyes briefly. "Fair enough." The elevator continued climbing. Keisha finally spoke again. "You know the strange part?" Mark glanced toward her carefully. "What?" "I almost left." That surprised him instantly. "What do you mean?" Keisha folded her arms loosely. "For a second, I thought about walking out." Mark frowned. "Why?" She looked toward the elevator numbers glowing above the doors. "Because sometimes you get tired." Her voice stayed calm, but something underneath it felt heavier now. "Tired of what?" Keisha hesitated briefly, then answered honestly. "Fighting people just to exist comfortably in certain spaces." Silence. Real silence this time. Mark felt those words settle hard inside his chest. Not because she sounded dramatic, because she sounded experienced. Like this wasn't one bad morning. Like this was years, years of moments, years of looks, years of assumptions. And suddenly Mark hated the fact that he added himself to that list. The elevator doors opened softly onto the executive floor. The energy changed instantly. Several executives standing nearby straightened the second they saw Keisha. Smiles appeared immediately. Warm greetings, sudden respect. Mark noticed every bit of it now, and for the first time in his career, corporate behavior looked ugly to him. Because nothing about Keisha changed in the last 20 minutes. Only her status did. The founder approached quickly once he saw her. "There you are." Keisha smiled genuinely for the first time all morning. "You still enjoy dramatic entrances, huh?" The older man chuckled warmly. "And you still enjoy arriving without warning people." Their familiarity immediately filled the hallway naturally. Not forced, not performative, real. Mark stood quietly behind them, feeling strangely exposed. The founder finally turned toward him. "Mark." "Yes, sir." "You owe her more than an apology." The hallway became painfully quiet again. Several executives suddenly found their phones fascinating. Mark nodded slowly. "I know." Before the moment could become more uncomfortable, Keisha stepped in calmly. "We're here for business," she said. "Let's keep it professional." Mark looked at her immediately. Again. Grace. Even now she protected the room from turning uglier, even after what happened downstairs. The founder studied Mark for another second before nodding once. Conference room. 5 minutes. People slowly dispersed. Mark stayed behind, gathering himself emotionally, while Keisha adjusted the strap of her bag again. "You didn't have to help me just now," he admitted quietly. Keisha looked at him calmly. "I wasn't helping you." That caught him off guard. "I was protecting the meeting." Another honest answer, and somehow he respected her even more for it. Inside the executive conference room, tension settled immediately once everyone took their seats. But now the atmosphere felt different. Careful, measured. Executives who barely acknowledged Keisha earlier now greeted her respectfully. A few even seemed overly friendly. Keisha noticed, so did Mark. Neither commented on it. The founder opened the meeting formally, while presentation screens illuminated across the walls. Then Keisha began speaking, and within 10 minutes, the entire room changed. Not because she spoke loudly, because she spoke confidently, calmly, precisely. Every market projection she explained carried clarity. Every investment concern received direct answers. Every expansion risk already had strategic solutions prepared. At one point, a senior executive attempted explaining neighborhood growth trends on the South Side. Keisha smiled politely. "I grew up 7 minutes from that intersection." Silence. Then she corrected his numbers from memory. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair, watching her carefully now. Really watching her. Not the blazer, not the appearance. Her mind, her discipline, her preparation, her confidence under pressure. And the deeper the meeting went, the worse he felt about downstairs. Because now one thing became painfully obvious. Keisha earned her place in this room long before anybody mentioned her connection to the founder. That realization humbled him deeply. For nearly 3 hours, she controlled the room effortlessly. Not through intimidation, through competence. People listened when she spoke because she knew what she was talking about. Simple as that. And somehow, that made Mark feel smaller than any public humiliation could have. By the end of the meeting, executives slowly filtered out, carrying folders and laptops while discussing projections quietly among themselves. Mark stayed seated longer than necessary, pretending to organize paperwork. Truthfully, he didn't know what to say anymore. Keisha stood near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago while gray clouds drifted over the skyline. The room finally became quiet. Mark looked toward her carefully. "You were impressive today." Keisha glanced back. "That supposed to repair the damage?" "No," he admitted honestly. That answer surprised her slightly. Mark stood slowly, then took a breath. "Can I buy you dinner?" Keisha blinked once. That apology elevator ride wasn't enough? A small smile almost reached Mark's face. "I'm serious." Keisha studied him carefully now, long enough to make him nervous. Finally, she asked softly, "Why?" Mark opened his mouth, then stopped, because honestly, he wasn't completely sure himself. Attraction was part of it. Definitely. But it felt deeper already. She unsettled him, made him look at himself differently, made him uncomfortable in ways that felt necessary. Finally, he answered truthfully, "Because I'd rather not have the worst moment of my week be the only thing you remember about me." For the first time all day. Keisha smiled slightly. 3 nights later, Mark stood outside a restaurant on the South Side feeling completely out of place. Not unsafe, Not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. Chicago looked different here at night. Downtown carried polished pressure. Everybody walked fast. Everybody guarded themselves carefully. Even conversations sounded expensive. But here, life breathed louder. Music floated from passing cars, waiting at red lights. Somebody laughed hard across the street, while two older men argued passionately outside a corner store about basketball, like the outcome personally affected them. The sidewalks carried energy, real energy, not corporate networking energy, human energy. Warmth spilled from the restaurant windows beside him, while the smell of fried catfish and cornbread drifted into the street. Mark adjusted his coat once, while looking through the glass entrance. Inside looked crowded, loud too. He checked his watch instinctively, then immediately felt stupid for doing it. Keisha noticed the movement the second she stepped outside. "There it is," she said. Mark looked up. "What?" "That corporate survival reflex." He laughed softly. "I was checking the time." You don't believe me?" "Not even a little." That smile appeared on her face again. Small, natural, dangerous. Tonight, she looked completely different from the woman standing inside Blackridge 3 days earlier. Dark jeans, brown coat, natural curls loose around her shoulders now. No executive posture, no polished corporate energy, just Keisha. And honestly, Mark forgot what he planned to say. Keisha noticed immediately. "Oh no," she teased. "You got quiet again." "I'm thinking, that sounds expensive too." Mark laughed under his breath. "You make fun of me a lot. You gave me a pretty strong opening impression." "Fair." Keisha folded her arms lightly against the cold wind moving through the street. "You nervous?" Mark considered lying. Instead, he surprised himself. A little. Her expression softened slightly. "Why?" He glanced toward the restaurant. "Feels like everybody in there already knows you." "They do. That's not helping." Keisha laughed quietly and pushed the door open. "Well, come on then." The warmth inside hit immediately. Music played softly overhead, while plates clattered near the kitchen. Conversations bounced across the room naturally. Nothing sounded controlled or polished. People were actually enjoying themselves. A server near the counter lit up instantly seeing Keisha. "There she go." Keisha pointed immediately. "Don't start. Too late." An older woman near the kitchen entrance turned around quickly, wiping her hands on an apron. Then her eyes landed directly on Mark. And suddenly, he understood. He was being evaluated. Fast, the woman approached with narrowed eyes full of amusement. "Well now," she said slowly. "You finally brought somebody in here." Keisha nearly choked laughing. "Miss Loretta, please." "What?" The older woman replied innocently. "I'm being welcoming." "No, you're not." Miss Loretta ignored her completely while staring at Mark. "You treat her right?" Mark blinked once. Direct question. No warm-up. No pretending. Keisha covered her face immediately. "Oh my God." But strangely enough, Mark appreciated the honesty. "I'm trying to recover from a terrible first impression," he admitted. Miss Loretta studied him another second, then nodded seriously. Then you got work to do." Keisha laughed hard enough people nearby looked over smiling, and for the first time all week, Mark relaxed, actually relaxed. Miss Loretta pointed toward a booth near the back. "Sit down before your food gets cold," thinking about itself. "Yes, ma'am," Mark answered automatically. Keisha immediately looked amused. "Oh, wow. What? You hit her with the, 'Yes, ma'am' already. I know how survival works. That might save you tonight." They slid into the booth while warm music floated around them softly. Mark looked around carefully. Family photos covered one wall near the kitchen. A television above the counter played basketball highlights while somebody argued loudly about missed free throws near the register. Everything felt alive. Not staged, not curated for appearance. Real. A server dropped menus onto the table. Keisha didn't even open hers. "You already know what you want." Mark asked. "I've been eating here since I was 12. That feels unfair." "You'll survive." He looked down at the menu, then back up. "Okay, I need guidance immediately." Keisha smirked. "Scared? I don't recognize half these side dishes." "That's because your people think seasoning is aggressive." Mark laughed loud enough to surprise himself. A couple nearby glanced over, smiling. You really came prepared tonight. Oh, I've been waiting for this. Dinner arrived quickly. Fried catfish, mac and cheese, candied yams, cornbread, greens. Mark stared at the table. This looks amazing. Keisha pointed her fork toward him. Careful. One good meal, and suddenly, you'll start driving to this neighborhood twice a week. Honestly, I already understand why. And he meant it. The food tasted like somebody cared while making it. That was the difference. Not expensive presentation, care. Keisha watched his expression carefully after the first bite. Oh, wow, she said dramatically. You just had a spiritual experience. Mark shook his head slowly. I've wasted money my entire life. That made her laugh again. God, he liked hearing her laugh. Too much already. Conversation flowed easier after that. No tension, no boardrooms, no power dynamics. Just two people talking. Keisha told stories about church mothers gossiping during Sunday service while pretending to pray 5 seconds later. Mark admitted his mother once forced him through 6 months of violin lessons because she thought it looked disciplined. You play violin? Keisha asked. No. Then what happened? I strategically failed. She nearly dropped her fork laughing. That is absolutely something you would say. At one point, Mark admitted he once spent $90 on a salad during a Los Angeles business trip. Keisha stared at him in complete disbelief. $90? It had edible flowers. That makes it worse. I know that now. You paid rent money for decorative leaves. Mark laughed so hard he leaned back in the booth. And, slowly, without realizing it, something shifted between them. The tension faded. Walls lowered. Keisha leaned comfortably against the booth now, while talking about growing up on the South Side. Summer block parties, loud family cookouts, her grandmother threatening everybody with church announcements if they misbehaved publicly. Mark listened carefully to every word. Because unlike most people around him, Keisha never sounded like she was performing her personality. She was just herself. That honesty pulled him in more every minute. Eventually, the conversation softened naturally. Less joking now, more personal. Mark glanced toward the window briefly, before speaking quietly. My father believed resting made people weak. Keisha looked at him carefully. He hard on you growing up? Mark laughed once, without humor. Nothing was ever enough. The words came out before he could stop them. Keisha stayed quiet. So he kept talking. Good grades weren't impressive. They were expected. He looked down at the table briefly. Success always moved farther away every time I reached something. Keisha watched him closely now, not judging, just listening. And honestly, that felt unfamiliar to Mark. Most people listened, waiting for their turn to speak. Keisha listened to understand. Big difference. Mark rubbed his hands together once, then finally admitted something he clearly never said aloud often. I honestly don't know how to stop proving myself. Silence settled gently between them. Not uncomfortable silence, heavy silence, the honest kind, and for the first time since meeting him, Keisha saw something underneath the expensive suits and executive confidence. Exhaustion, real exhaustion. After dinner, Mark sat inside his car, outside Keisha's apartment building, nearly 20 minutes longer than necessary. The engine was off, music low, Chicago traffic moving quietly in the distance. And somehow, he still wasn't ready to leave. Keisha leaned back comfortably in the passenger seat while scrolling through something on her phone. You know, she said casually, normal people usually go home after dinner. Mark looked over. Who said I was normal? That explains a lot, actually. He laughed softly. The ease between them surprised him. 3 days ago, she barely tolerated him. Now they sat parked outside her building talking like people who had known each other much longer. Keisha finally looked up from her phone. You always this quiet, after opening up emotionally? I'm recovering. From what? Saying personal things out loud. She smiled faintly. Must have been traumatic. You have no idea. Keisha laughed under her breath and looked out the windshield again. The neighborhood remained alive, even this late. Music somewhere nearby. A couple arguing across the street. Kids still riding bikes under streetlights while somebody yelled from a second-floor window for them to come inside. Life, that was the word Mark kept thinking about whenever he was around her. Life felt present here, not hidden behind polished walls and expensive distractions. Keisha finally opened the passenger door slowly. "Well, thanks for dinner. You're thanking me after you bullied me about a $90 salad? That salad deserved consequences." Mark smiled. "Fair enough." She stepped out, then paused. "You coming tomorrow?" Mark frowned slightly. "Coming where?" "Food drive at church. You volunteering?" Mark blinked. "You volunteer on Saturdays?" Keisha gave him a look immediately. Was that surprising? "No," he answered quickly. "I just didn't know. Now you do." Then she smiled slightly. 10 o'clock. "Don't wear expensive shoes." Before Mark could answer, she shut the door gently and walked toward her building entrance. And somehow, he found himself smiling the entire drive home. The next few weeks changed things naturally between them. Not dramatically, quietly. Phone calls became routine. At first, it was short conversations after work, then longer ones. Then suddenly they were speaking almost every night, without either person acknowledging how strange that should have felt. One Thursday evening, Mark sat alone inside his condo, staring at spreadsheets spread across his dining table, while listening to Keisha complain through speakerphone. "I'm serious," she said. "Church mothers are dangerous." Mark smiled while typing notes into his laptop. "You keep saying that, because it's true. How dangerous can older women at church really be?" Keisha gasped dramatically. "Oh, you sweet sheltered man." He laughed quietly. "You exaggerate everything." "No. Listen carefully. Church mothers know everybody's business before the people living the business know it themselves." That sentence stressed me out. "It should." Mark leaned back in his chair, listening to her laugh softly through the phone. And there it was again. That feeling, comfort. His condo used to feel peaceful. Now, it just felt quiet when she wasn't there. "You still working?" she asked. "Unfortunately. You've been home 2 hours already." "How do you know that?" "You mentioned reheating coffee 40 minutes ago." Mark paused slightly. She paid attention. That realization warmed something in him unexpectedly. Keisha continued talking casually. "My grandmother used to say, overworking yourself is just another way people avoid dealing with themselves." That sounds targeted. It probably was. Mark smiled again, while rubbing his eyes tiredly. "Your grandmother seems wise." "She is." Pause. "She also thinks men with expensive watches are emotionally suspicious." Mark looked down at his watch immediately. "I feel attacked." "You should." Their conversations flowed like that often now. Teasing, honest, easy. But underneath the humor, something deeper kept growing slowly between them. One rainy evening after work, they sat parked outside her apartment again, while thunder rolled softly somewhere over the city. Neither moved to leave. Mark rested one arm against the steering wheel, while Keisha looked through rain sliding across the windshield. "You ever think about leaving Chicago?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes." "What stops you?" Keisha shrugged lightly. "Family, mostly." Then her expression softened. "My cousins still call me before doing anything important." "How many cousins you got?" "Too many." Mark laughed. "That's not a number. You clearly didn't grow up black." "Fair point." Keisha smiled faintly, before looking back toward the rain. "I helped raise a lot of them, though." Mark turned slightly toward her. "Really?" My sister moved away for work when I was younger. Somebody had to help." The way she said it sounded matter-of-fact. No self-praise, no dramatic sacrifice speech, just responsibility. Mark studied her quietly. "That's a lot for a teenager." Keisha gave a small shrug. "You do what needs to be done." Then she added softly, "Sometimes survival becomes your personality before you notice it." That sentence sat heavily inside the car. Mark understood it immediately. Different worlds, same exhaustion. Keisha continued quietly. "I worked constantly growing up. Scholarships, night classes, side jobs, internships." She laughed softly to herself. "I used to keep extra clothes in my backpack because I'd go from classes straight to work." Mark frowned slightly. "That sounds exhausting." It was. "Why didn't you slow down?" Keisha looked at him carefully now. People like me don't usually get many mistakes. Silence. Again, she said things so calmly that it took a second for the weight behind them to fully land. Mark looked down briefly at his hands, then, unexpectedly, he spoke. My father used to check my grades before saying hello to me. Keisha blinked slightly. Mark laughed once, without humor. Sounds ridiculous out loud. No, she said softly. Sounds lonely. That word hit him harder than expected. Lonely. Because, the truth was, he had spent most of his life being admired, without actually feeling understood. Performance replaced connection early. Achievement replaced comfort. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing the difference. My father believed emotions distracted successful people, Mark admitted quietly. So what happened if you failed? He looked out the windshield. You learned not to fail again. The silence between them deepened, not awkward, just honest. Keisha studied him carefully now. For the first time since meeting him, she saw beyond the confidence completely. Underneath the expensive suits and executive control sat someone emotionally tired in a way that looked almost permanent. Mark noticed her, staring slightly. What? Keisha shook her head softly. Nothing. That's never true. A tiny smile touched her face. You hide loneliness really well. Mark froze slightly. No one had ever said that to him directly before, because nobody usually looked closely enough to notice. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, while neither spoke for several seconds. Then Mark said something quietly that surprised even himself. I think I'm more comfortable around you than I've been around anybody in years. Keisha's expression changed slightly, softer now, more careful. Neither looked away immediately. And suddenly, the air inside the car felt different. Still, close, dangerously close. But neither moved. Neither rushed the moment. They just sat there quietly, while Chicago rain blurred the world outside. And slowly, without either saying it aloud, the walls between them began disappearing. Chicago felt softer at night near the lake. The noise downtown faded differently there. Traffic still moved behind them. Buildings still glowed across the skyline. But near the water, people slowed down long enough to breathe. Cold wind rolled off Lake Michigan, while Mark and Keisha walked side by side along the riverwalk beneath rows of glowing city lights. Neither seemed in a hurry tonight. Their conversations had started changing lately. Less surface-level teasing, more honesty, more pauses that actually meant something. Keisha pulled her coat tighter as wind brushed through her curls. You know what's strange? She asked quietly. Mark glanced over. What? You're completely different outside work. He smiled slightly. That bad in the office? You were one motivational speech away from becoming a supervillain. Mark laughed hard enough. A couple walking nearby looked over briefly. I deserve that. Yes, she answered immediately. He shook his head, smiling. You enjoy humbling me. No, Keisha corrected softly. I enjoy watching you become a person. That answer stayed with him, because somehow she always said things that sounded light at first, then hit deeper 2 seconds later. They continued walking slowly, while water moved quietly beside the concrete path. Mark glanced toward her again. You still think about that first day? Keisha stayed quiet for a second. Sometimes, his expression tightened slightly. I hate that answer. I know. The honesty between them had become dangerous now. There was nowhere left to hide inside conversations anymore. Mark slid his hands into his coat pockets against the cold. I really was that guy, huh? Keisha looked ahead toward the skyline. That version of you existed. Yes. Version, not identity. Mark noticed the difference immediately. You think people can actually change? Keisha smiled faintly. That depends. On what? Whether they care enough to face themselves honestly. That landed hard, because Mark knew exactly what she meant. Most people apologized to escape consequences. Very few apologized because they genuinely hated what they saw in themselves. Keisha stopped walking near the railing overlooking the water. The wind pushed softly through her curls, while city lights reflected across the dark lake behind her. Mark stepped beside her quietly. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Keisha asked something unexpected. You know what made me give you another chance? Mark looked over carefully. What? Her eyes stayed on the water. You looked ashamed. Mark blinked once. Keisha finally turned toward him fully now. Most people don't. Silence. Real silence. Not awkward, not empty, honest. Keisha folded her arms lightly against the wind. Most people get defensive when they hurt somebody. She looked at him carefully. They explain. They justify. They protect themselves. Pause. But you looked like you actually saw what you did. Mark swallowed slightly, because the truth was, the moment the founder spoke upstairs, Mark didn't just realize Keisha was important. He realized he had become the exact kind of man he used to quietly judge growing up. The kind who assumed power meant perception. The kind who confused instinct with superiority. And honestly, that realization embarrassed him more than the public mistake itself. I keep replaying it in my head sometimes, he admitted quietly. Keisha studied him. The lobby? He nodded. I hear myself saying it, and immediately hate the sound of it. You should. No softness, no fake comfort, just truth. But somehow, it didn't feel cruel. Because she wasn't trying to punish him anymore. She was simply refusing to lie for his comfort. Mark leaned both arms against the railing, while staring out toward the dark water. My father used to say, powerful people need strong instincts. Keisha raised an eyebrow slightly. That sounds dangerous. It was. He laughed softly under his breath. I spent years believing being decisive made me intelligent. Keisha looked at him carefully now. And now? Mark thought for a second, then answered honestly. Now I think listening probably matters more. A small smile touched her face. That's growth. I'm trying. I know. Those two words warmed him more than they should have. Because Keisha noticed effort, not performance. Effort. That difference mattered deeply to her. A gust of wind moved through the walkway stronger this time. Keisha rubbed her hands together against the cold. Without thinking, Mark reached for her hand gently. The moment happened naturally. No dramatic buildup. No forced tension. Just instinct. But unlike the first instinct that brought them together, this one carried care instead of judgment. Keisha looked down briefly at his hand holding hers, then slowly looked back up at him. Neither moved away, and suddenly, the city around them faded quieter. Mark's voice lowered naturally. You scare me a little. Keisha laughed softly. That's concerning. I'm serious. Why? He held her gaze this time. Because you make me aware of myself. That answer surprised her slightly. Mark continued before he lost courage. I've spent most of my life around people who either wanted something from me or were intimidated by me. Keisha stayed quiet. But with you, he admitted softly, I actually care what kind of man I am. Her expression softened completely now. And honestly, that scared her a little too, because she believed him. That was the dangerous part. Not charm, not attraction, sincerity. Mark stepped a little closer unconsciously. Close enough now to notice the tiny nervous breath she took. Close enough to feel warmth beneath the cold wind. His eyes dropped briefly toward her lips, then back to her eyes immediately, giving her space to move away. Keisha noticed that too, always careful now, always intentional. And that mattered more than he realized. For a second, neither spoke. The moment stretched naturally between them. Then Keisha smiled softly. You think a lot for somebody who used to throw people out of buildings. Mark groaned quietly. Please don't describe it like that. I'm absolutely describing it like that forever. He laughed under his breath again. And just like that, tension loosened slightly. That was their rhythm now. Honesty, vulnerability, then humor before things became too heavy. Keisha squeezed his hand gently once. Small gesture, huge impact. Mark looked down briefly at their hands together, then back at her, and something settled inside him quietly. Peace, not excitement, not ego. Peace. Keisha saw it happen too. The shift in his face, the way he relaxed around her now without trying to impress her constantly. That was the moment she understood something important. Mark wasn't pretending anymore. The polished executive version of him kept disappearing little by little every time they talked. And the man underneath? She actually liked him. Maybe more than she should. Keisha stepped slightly closer now herself. Not enough to kiss him, but enough to remove uncertainty. Enough to say, I'm here too. Mark looked at her carefully, almost disbelieving. You're really giving me another chance? Keisha smiled softly. No. He blinked. No? You already got the second chance. Then her eyes held his steadily. This is me deciding whether you deserve the third. Mark laughed quietly while shaking his head. That sounds terrifying. It should, but neither let go of the other's hand. And for the first time since that cold morning inside Blackridge Financial, Keisha finally allowed herself to believe Mark might actually become someone worth trusting emotionally. By early summer, Chicago had changed completely. The cold tension that once sat over the city disappeared beneath warm nights, crowded rooftops, and music floating through downtown streets long after midnight. And somewhere during those months, Mark changed too. Not dramatically, quietly, the kind of change people around him noticed before he did. He started leaving work earlier, stopped snapping at assistants over tiny mistakes, actually listened during conversations instead of waiting for people to finish talking. Even Blackridge employees began relaxing slightly around him. Nobody understood why. Keisha did. She noticed it first during small moments. The way he held doors without thinking now. The way he remembered names. The way he stopped treating every interaction like a competition. But tonight wasn't about quiet moments. Tonight was Blackridge's annual charity gala. And honestly, Keisha already regretted agreeing to come. The ballroom inside the downtown hotel looked exactly like the kind of place designed to make people perform wealth. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, while waiters carried champagne through crowds dressed in designer suits and gowns worth more than most people's rent. Every laugh sounded slightly rehearsed. Every conversation carried calculation underneath it. Mark adjusted his cufflinks while glancing toward Keisha beside him. You okay? Keisha forced a polite smile. Absolutely. He immediately knew that meant no. She looked beautiful tonight. Dangerously beautiful. Black dress, simple jewelry, hair pinned back elegantly. But Mark noticed the tension in her shoulders instantly. You can still back out, he said quietly, and leave you alone with these people. That almost sounded protective. It sounded realistic. Mark smiled slightly. God, he liked her too much already. A group of executives approached almost immediately after they entered the ballroom. Big smiles, polished greetings, corporate warmth. One woman air-kissed near Keisha's cheek without actually touching her. So good to finally see you outside meetings, she said smoothly. Keisha smiled politely. Happy to be here. Mark noticed it immediately. That tone, the carefully measured social energy wealthy people used whenever they didn't fully know how to place somebody. Not openly rude. Never openly rude. That would require honesty. Instead, people in rooms like this specialized in subtle separation. One executive laughed lightly while adjusting his drink. So how exactly did you two meet? Mark answered naturally. At work. The man nodded slowly. Ah. That tiny response carried more judgment than an insult would have. Keisha noticed it too. Of course she did. Another woman joined the conversation, smiling tightly. Well, Blackridge certainly keeps finding impressive consultants lately. There it was. Keisha kept her expression calm, but Mark heard it now, clearly. The assumption underneath the compliment. Another consultant. Like her intelligence needed explanation before acceptance. Keisha reached for a champagne glass from a passing tray calmly. You'd be surprised how much talent exists outside your usual circles, she replied smoothly. The woman blinked once, still smiling, but less comfortably now. Mark almost smiled into his drink. That was another thing about Keisha. She rarely embarrassed people directly. She simply handed their ignorance back to them politely and let them sit with it. The conversations around them continued shifting awkwardly. Stock markets, vacation homes, political donors, the kind of discussions where people casually referenced money without ever mentioning actual numbers. Keisha remained composed beside him, but Mark noticed something important. She was shrinking slightly emotionally, not insecurity, exhaustion. Like constantly navigating these spaces required energy she didn't want to waste tonight. You want to get out of here for a minute? Mark asked quietly. Before she answered, another voice interrupted nearby. Mark. An older investor approached confidently through the crowd carrying a glass of bourbon, silver hair, expensive tuxedo, the kind of man who spoke too loudly because power had protected him from consequences too long. He shook Mark's hand firmly. "Good to see you, son." "Good seeing you too." Then the man's eyes moved toward Keisha slowly, and immediately, Mark felt something tighten internally, because he recognized that look now. The investor smiled broadly. "And who's this beautiful young lady?" Keisha extended her hand politely. "Keisha." The investor barely acknowledged the handshake. Instead, he chuckled toward Mark. "You always did have good taste." Silence, not dramatic silence, the dangerous kind. The kind where everybody nearby heard exactly what happened, but pretended they didn't. Keisha's expression stayed controlled beautifully, but Mark saw it. That tiny emotional withdrawal behind her eyes, like somebody quietly closing a door, and suddenly, something hit him hard. Months ago, he probably would not have noticed that moment at all. Now, he saw everything. The dismissal, the reduction, the assumption that she existed beside him, instead of beside her own accomplishments. The investor continued casually. "So what field are you in, sweetheart?" "Sweetheart." Mark felt irritation move through him instantly. Keisha answered calmly anyway. "Investment strategy." The investor laughed lightly. "Well, Mark, better keep you around then." That did it. Mark lowered his drink slowly. "This is Keisha," he said firmly. "One of the smartest investment minds Blackridge works with." The investor blinked slightly, probably surprised by the tone more than the words. Mark continued calmly. "She's the reason half the people in this room suddenly care about Chicago expansion." Now nearby conversations began slowing. People were listening. The investor laughed awkwardly. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it." Mark held eye contact steadily. "I know." That answer hit harder than anger would have, because everybody understood what he actually meant. "You didn't mean harm. You just never learned to see people correctly." The investor cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, enjoy your evening." Then he walked away much faster than he arrived. For a second, neither Mark nor Keisha spoke. The ballroom noise continued around them. Music, laughter, glasses clinking. But something important had shifted permanently inside Mark, because for the first time in his life, he experienced what it felt like watching someone he cared about get quietly disrespected in front of him. Not loudly, not publicly enough for outrage, just enough to remind her she would always have to work harder to be fully seen in rooms like this. Keisha finally exhaled softly. "You didn't have to do that." Mark looked at her carefully. "Yes, I did." "No," she corrected gently. Her eyes held his steadily now. "You finally understood." And honestly, that hurt more than he expected. They left the gala earlier than expected. Neither said much, while the elevator carried them down from the ballroom. The energy from upstairs still clung to the air around them. Expensive perfume, fake smiles, carefully polished disrespect. Mark loosened his tie the second they stepped outside the hotel. Warm summer air rushed through downtown Chicago, while traffic reflected across wet streets beneath glowing city lights. "You hungry?" he asked quietly. Keisha shook her head. "Not really." "You want to go home?" She hesitated, then looked toward the riverwalk nearby. "Walk with me?" Mark nodded immediately. The city felt calmer near the water. Couples passed slowly beneath streetlights while boats drifted quietly farther down the river. Music floated faintly from rooftop bars somewhere in the distance. For several minutes, they walked side by side without speaking. Not awkward, just thoughtful. Mark kept replaying the investor's words in his head. "You always did have good taste." The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. Not because the comment was shocking, because nobody else upstairs reacted to it. Nobody looked surprised. That meant they were used to moments like that. And suddenly, Mark realized something uncomfortable. Keisha probably was too. He glanced toward her carefully. "You deal with that often?" Keisha gave a small laugh without humor. "That depends." "On what?" "How honest you want the answer." "Completely honest." She looked ahead toward the water, while folding her arms lightly. "Then yes." Simple answer, heavy answer. Mark stayed quiet. Keisha continued calmly. Tonight wasn't even close to the worst version. That made his stomach tighten immediately. She noticed. "Relax," she said softly. "You don't have to look guilty every time somebody else disappoints you. But I do feel guilty." "Why?" Mark frowned slightly. "Because I never noticed how common this was before." Keisha nodded slowly. "That's usually how privilege works. No accusation, no bitterness. Just truth." They walked a few more steps before she spoke again. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "Growing up, teachers always acted surprised when I answered questions correctly." Mark looked over immediately. "What?" Keisha smiled faintly. "Elementary school, high school too." Her expression stayed calm, but her eyes looked distant now. "Every time I scored high on something, somebody wanted an explanation. That's insane." She kicked lightly at a crack in the sidewalk while walking. "If I spoke confidently, I had an attitude. If I stayed quiet, people assumed I wasn't smart." Mark listened carefully beside her. "At some point, you start realizing the rules change depending on who's standing in the room." That sentence sat heavily between them. Keisha continued quietly. "I remember getting one scholarship in college." She laughed softly to herself. "A professor actually asked if I got it through diversity placement before checking my grades." Mark stopped walking briefly. "You serious?" Keisha looked back at him. "You really think tonight was my first experience with assumptions?" No. Now he knew it wasn't. That realization hit differently after seeing it himself. Because before tonight, Mark understood her experiences intellectually. Now, he felt them emotionally. Different thing entirely. They continued walking slowly beside the water again. "What about work?" he asked carefully. Keisha smiled tiredly. "Corporate America loves diversity in brochures." Mark winced slightly. "That bad?" "Sometimes worse." She glanced toward him briefly. "I've had people repeat my ideas in meetings like they suddenly became smarter once a man said them." Mark's jaw tightened. "I've watched executives praise me privately, then introduce me publicly like I was somebody's assistant." Pause. "And honestly, the exhausting part isn't even the disrespect." "What is it?" "Having to stay calm through it." Mark looked at her quietly. Keisha exhaled slowly. "Because the second you react emotionally." She shrugged lightly. "Now you're the problem." That one hit him hard. Hard enough that he felt embarrassed thinking about how easily he moved through life without considering any of this. "You carry all this constantly?" he asked softly. Keisha laughed once. "You don't really get to put it down." Silence settled between them again. But now it felt heavier, more personal, more real. A boat horn echoed somewhere across the water, while city lights shimmered beside them. Mark rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, then asked the question carefully. "What about dating?" Keisha smirked immediately. "Oh, now that conversation is dangerous. I still want to hear it." She studied him briefly before answering. "Some men liked me privately but not publicly." Mark's expression changed instantly. "What does that mean?" "It means they liked me until their friends had opinions." That made him angry immediately. Keisha noticed. "Relax. That's not even the worst part." "How does it get worse than that?" She looked forward again. "Some people treated dating me like rebellion." Mark slowed slightly beside her. "What?" Keisha shook her head faintly. "You'd be surprised how many men think dating a black woman makes them interesting." The disgust in her voice stayed subtle, but it was there. "And some people," she added quietly, "just wanted the experience." Mark stared at her. Experience. Not relationship. Not partnership. Experience. Like she was something temporary to try, instead of someone to genuinely know. For the first time all evening, Mark genuinely looked hurt. Not offended for himself. Hurt for her. Keisha noticed the expression immediately. And weirdly, that softened her a little. Because most people reacted defensively during conversations like this, Mark just listened. Actually listened. "You know the strange thing?" she said quietly. "What?" "You're one of the first people who didn't interrupt me halfway through explaining this stuff." Mark blinked slightly. "Why would I interrupt?" "Because most people start defending themselves." That hurt to hear too. Because she said it like experience taught her to expect disappointment from conversations about race, class, or identity. Mark stopped walking completely this time. Keisha turned toward him slowly. The city glowed behind them while wind moved softly off the lake. I didn't know, he admitted quietly. She held his gaze. I know. No, he said more firmly. I really didn't understand. Keisha studied him carefully now, and for the first time since they met, she saw emotional pain on his face that had nothing to do with his own ego. Just empathy. Pure empathy. Mark shook his head slowly. All this time I thought I was observant. Keisha's expression softened slightly. You were observant. Not enough. Silence. Then Keisha stepped a little closer beside him. Not romantic. Not dramatic. Just honest. And quietly she said, You finally saw it. Something changed in Mark after that night by the river. Not suddenly. Not dramatically enough for people to point at one exact moment and say, There. That's when he became different. It happened quietly, the way real growth usually does. Monday morning at Blackridge Financial felt normal on the surface. Elevators crowded, phones ringing, assistants moving quickly between offices carrying coffee and presentation folders. But people noticed something strange almost immediately. Mark wasn't rushing. Normally, he moved through the office like every second cost money. Focused, sharp, intimidating without trying. Today felt different. A younger analyst accidentally bumped into him near the executive hallway, nearly dropping an entire stack of financial reports across the floor. The man froze instantly. Oh God, I'm sorry. Mark looked down at the scattered papers, then crouched to help pick them up. The analyst blinked in shock. You don't have to. It's fine, Mark said calmly. Employees walking past slowed slightly. Because that wasn't normal, not from him. Mark handed the reports back without irritation. Take a breath, he added. Nobody died. The analyst looked genuinely confused. Right. Okay. Mark continued walking toward his office, but something about the interaction stayed with him, because months ago, he absolutely would have reacted differently. Impatience, coldness, maybe even embarrassment, disguised as professionalism. Now all he could think about was Keisha, asking one simple question beside the lake. How honest do you want the answer? That question still sat heavily in his mind, because the truth was, Mark had spent most of his life confusing efficiency with character. He thought being respected mattered more than being kind. Thought control mattered more than understanding people. And somewhere along the way, success became armor instead of achievement. Inside his office, Mark stared through the giant windows overlooking downtown Chicago while the city moved beneath gray morning clouds. Then, unexpectedly, he picked up his phone and called his mother. The line rang twice before she answered. Well, she said immediately, either somebody died or you finally remembered I exist. Mark smiled despite himself. Good morning to you too. He leaned back slowly in his chair. What are you doing? There was a pause. Then Mark, it's 9:30 on a Tuesday. Normal retired people are awake already. He laughed quietly. I walked into that one. Yes, you did. For a second, neither spoke. Not awkward. Just unfamiliar. Because conversations between them usually stayed short. Surface level. Efficient. Exactly how his father raised him. His mother finally asked softly, You all right? Mark stared out the window for a second, then answered honestly, I think so. You think so? He rubbed his jaw slowly. I've just been thinking lately. That sounds dangerous. Mark smiled faintly. Probably. Then silence again. But this time, he didn't rush to end it. That was new too. His mother noticed immediately. You met somebody. Mark blinked. What? You heard me. How did you get there from one phone call? Because you sound human today. He laughed harder this time. Real laughter. And weirdly, he felt lighter afterward. That afternoon during a strategy meeting, another change happened. One of the junior employees started presenting market projections nervously near the conference screen, while senior executives interrupted every few seconds. Normally, Mark would have focused only on results. Today he noticed something else. The employee could barely finish a sentence. Finally, Mark leaned forward calmly. Let him finish. The room quieted immediately. The younger employee looked stunned. Mark nodded toward him. Go ahead. Confidence slowly returned to the presentation afterward. Not perfectly, but enough, and while listening, Mark realized something uncomfortable again. Keisha had changed the way he saw rooms entirely. Now he noticed who got interrupted, who got dismissed, who people listened to immediately, and who constantly had to prove themselves first. Once you start seeing that kind of thing, you can't really stop. Later that evening, Mark sat across from Keisha inside her apartment while she organized containers from the church food drive on her kitchen counter. "You're staring again," she said without looking up. "I'm observing." "That sounds even creepier." Mark smiled quietly. The apartment smelled like cinnamon candles and takeout containers, while old R&B played softly in the background. Comfort. That word kept returning whenever he was here. Keisha finally looked over. "What's on your mind?" Mark hesitated briefly, then answered truthfully, "You changed me." She immediately pointed a spoon toward him. "Don't say that like I kidnapped your personality. I'm serious." Keisha leaned against the counter, carefully watching him now. Mark rubbed his hands together once before continuing. "I notice things now that I never used to." "What kind of things?" "The way people treat each other." She stayed quiet. "The way some people get questioned before being trusted." Another pause. "The way confidence looks different, depending on who's speaking." Keisha's expression softened slightly. Mark looked down briefly. "I think I spent years becoming successful without paying attention to what kind of man I was becoming." Silence settled softly around them. Not heavy this time, just honest. Keisha walked toward the couch slowly before sitting beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "That kind of awareness doesn't happen easily," she said quietly. "Feels embarrassing, honestly." "Why?" "Because I should have known better." Keisha shook her head gently. "No." Mark looked over. "You learned better." That difference mattered, and she knew it. People changed when they wanted truth more than comfort. That's what she saw happening in him now. Not performance, not guilt. Growth. Real growth. Mark glanced toward her carefully. "You really believe people can become different?" Keisha smiled faintly. "I wouldn't still be sitting here if I didn't." Something warm settled inside his chest, hearing that. Not excitement, something steadier, safer. Keisha reached for the remote, lowering the music slightly, then looked at him thoughtfully. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "You listen differently now." Mark frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "You don't listen waiting to respond anymore." That surprised him, because he realized she was right. Before meeting Keisha, most conversations felt strategic, even personal ones. Now, he actually cared what she felt before thinking about his own response. That terrified him a little, because feelings this genuine came with risk. And somehow Keisha saw that fear too. "You're thinking too loud again," she teased softly. Mark laughed under his breath. "Sorry." "No, you're not. Probably not." They smiled at each other quietly, and suddenly, Mark noticed something dangerous. The apartment, the music, her sitting beside him comfortably, the peace he felt around her. It no longer felt temporary. It felt necessary. That realization hit him slowly. Then all at once, Mark looked at Keisha carefully while she adjusted one of the food containers beside her. And for the first time in his life, he realized he was completely in love with her. Love felt easier outside Blackridge. That became the problem. Inside the company, people watched everything, especially powerful people, especially successful people, and especially relationships nobody fully understood. At first, the whispers stayed quiet. A few looks during meetings, conversations stopping. When Mark entered executive hallways, assistants suddenly becoming awkward whenever Keisha visited the office. Small things, easy things to ignore. Until they weren't. Monday morning started badly. Mark walked into the executive conference room carrying coffee, while two senior executives lowered their voices too late after noticing him. "All I'm saying is the timing looks convenient." The second executive cleared his throat quickly. "Morning, Mark." Mark stopped near the table slowly. "What timing?" Neither answered immediately. That alone irritated him. The first executive forced a smile. Nothing important. Mark stared at him for another second, then sat down without responding. But the irritation stayed, because lately, Everybody at Blackridge suddenly seemed fascinated by his relationship. Not openly, never openly. People at that level preferred polished gossip, the kind hidden behind professional language. Later that afternoon, things became worse. Keisha arrived at Blackridge for an expansion strategy session, carrying a folder against her side, while employees greeted her carefully near the elevators. Too carefully. She noticed immediately. People who once ignored her now smiled too hard. Others watched her too long. One assistant accidentally called her Mrs. Mark before immediately turning red with embarrassment. Keisha laughed politely. But internally, exhaustion returned immediately. That old exhaustion. The kind she thought she escaped temporarily. Inside the conference room, several executives already sat reviewing documents quietly. The second Keisha entered, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough. One executive smiled thinly. Well, now we know why Chicago expansion suddenly became such a priority. A few people laughed softly. Keisha placed her folder down calmly. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Oh, come on, the woman replied lightly. We're all adults here. Mark entered seconds later and instantly felt the tension. What's going on? Nobody answered directly. That annoyed him immediately. Keisha stayed composed. Apparently people think my relationship affects investment decisions. Mark's expression hardened. That's ridiculous. The woman lifted one shoulder casually. I'm just saying, perceptions matter. Perceptions. There it was again. Corporate language loved hiding ugly ideas behind polished vocabulary. Mark looked around the room sharply. Keisha earned her position before she ever met me. Silence. But nobody looked embarrassed enough. That part bothered him most, because the comments weren't random anymore. They were becoming normalized. And deep down, Mark knew exactly why. Some people still struggled seeing Keisha as powerful without attaching her success to somebody else. The meeting continued awkwardly afterward. Numbers, expansion forecasts, investor concerns, but the energy never recovered fully. Keisha spoke less than usual. Mark noticed immediately. Normally, she controlled rooms calmly. Today, she stayed quieter. Shorter answers. Less engagement. By the time the meeting ended, frustration sat visibly across Mark's face. Keisha gathered her folders carefully. You okay? He asked quietly. I'm fine. He frowned. That didn't sound convincing. Keisha sighed softly. I just don't feel like performing strength today. That sentence hit him immediately, because he understood what she meant now. Every room required emotional management from her. Every conversation required awareness. Every interaction carried invisible calculations underneath it. And honestly, she looked tired, not weak. Tired. Mark stepped closer near the hallway. You know none of that is true, right? Keisha looked at him calmly. That's not the point. Then what is? The point is, I'm exhausted. Her voice stayed controlled, but the emotion underneath it finally started showing now. I'm exhausted from constantly proving myself. Keisha, no, listen. She lowered her voice slightly after noticing employees nearby. I worked too hard to become somebody's office roomer. Mark felt defensive irritation rise immediately. That's not fair. Her expression changed slightly. What? You're acting like I caused this. Keisha blinked slowly. I didn't say that. But you're blaming me for what other people think. That landed badly. Immediately, Keisha stepped back half an inch, not dramatic. Just enough for him to feel it emotionally. Mark noticed too late. Because the truth was, he wasn't actually listening right now. He was reacting, protecting himself. Exactly the kind of behavior she warned him about before. Keisha crossed her arms quietly. You know what's frustrating? Mark rubbed his jaw impatiently. What? You still think this conversation is about your intentions? That shut him up instantly, because she was right. Again, Keisha shook her head faintly. I know you love me. The word hit him unexpectedly. Love, she said it naturally, like truth, but her eyes still looked tired. That's not the issue. Then help me understand. I'm trying, she answered softly. You just keep defending yourself instead of hearing me. Mark exhaled sharply. I'm defending us. No, Keisha corrected gently. You're defending your comfort. That one hurt, because deep down, some part of him knew she was telling the truth. The hallway became quiet around them, while employees pretended not to notice tension building nearby. Mark lowered his voice carefully. So, what do you want me to do? Keisha stared at him for a second, and suddenly, her exhaustion looked older than today, older than Blackridge, older than him. I want one place in my life where I don't have to explain why disrespect hurts. Silence. Mark opened his mouth, closed it again, because honestly, he didn't know how to answer that. Keisha adjusted the strap of her bag slowly, then finally spoke again. I should go. Keisha. I'm tired, Mark. Not angry. That almost made it worse. She looked emotionally worn down now, like the weight of constantly navigating people's assumptions had finally caught up to her again. Mark reached for her hand instinctively. She let him hold it briefly, but she didn't hold back the same way, and he noticed. That scared him more than arguing would have. Keisha pulled away gently, then looked directly into his eyes. For the first time since they met, there was distance there, real distance, and when she walked away down the hallway, Mark realized something dangerous. He had finally learned how to see her pain, but he still didn't fully know how to carry it with her. Mark barely worked the rest of the afternoon. He tried reading reports, tried answering emails, tried focusing during a conference call with New York. But every few minutes, his mind replayed the look on Keisha's face before she walked away. Not anger, that would have been easier. Anger at least sounded loud. This felt quieter, more dangerous. Disappointment had returned, and Mark hated himself for recognizing it again. By 8:30 that night, Chicago glowed beneath heavy summer clouds while Mark stood outside Keisha's apartment building, holding takeout. Neither of them were hungry enough to eat. The hallway outside her apartment felt longer tonight. He knocked twice, no answer immediately, then footsteps. The door opened slowly. Keisha stood there wearing gray sweatpants and one of her oversized t-shirts. Curls tied loosely back now, no makeup, no polished composure, just exhaustion. Mark's chest tightened instantly seeing her face. You didn't have to come over, she said quietly. Yeah, he answered softly. I did. She hesitated, then stepped aside silently. The apartment looked calmer than usual tonight. No music playing, no television noise, just the soft hum of the refrigerator somewhere behind the kitchen. Mark placed the food containers carefully on the counter. I brought dinner. Keisha gave a tired smile. That usually works better when people still want to eat together. That stung, because she wasn't trying to hurt him. She was just being honest again. Mark leaned both hands against the kitchen counter slowly. I handled today badly. Keisha crossed her arms lightly. You got defensive. I know. No, she corrected softly. I don't think you do. Mark looked up immediately. What does that mean? Keisha exhaled slowly before answering. It means every time I tried explaining how exhausted I felt. She paused briefly, searching for the right words. You kept trying to prove you weren't the problem. Mark frowned. Because I'm not. The second the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Keisha closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Again. That emotional wall she warned him about. Mark noticed immediately. Keisha. No, she interrupted quietly. That's exactly what I mean. Her voice never rose. That somehow made everything hurt worse. You still hear blame before you hear pain. Mark felt frustration rise instinctively. I'm trying to understand you. I know you are. Then why does it feel like everything I say is wrong lately? Keisha looked at him carefully now, and suddenly he realized she looked emotionally drained in a way he hadn't seen before. Not because she stopped loving him, because she was tired of carrying conversations emotionally while he defended himself. That's the problem, she admitted softly. What is? You think this is about winning the conversation correctly? Mark stepped back slightly. That's not fair. Keisha laughed once, without humor. See? What? You immediately decide fairness, based on how uncomfortable you feel. That landed hard. Hard enough that Mark went quiet instantly, but frustration still sat heavily inside him, because part of him genuinely believed he was trying, and another part of him feared trying still might not be enough. The silence between them stretched painfully now. Keisha walked toward the window slowly, while folding her arms against herself. Outside, city lights blurred through the glass beneath distant traffic. Mark watched her carefully. "You know I love you, right?" Keisha nodded faintly. "I do." "Then why does it feel like you're pushing me away?" She turned around slowly. And finally, the emotion underneath her exhaustion surfaced fully. "Because I'm scared." That caught him completely off guard. Mark's expression softened immediately. "Scared of what?" Keisha looked down briefly before answering. "Scared that one day you'll stop trying to understand." The apartment became very still after that. Mark felt something painful twist inside his chest. "Keisha." She shook her head softly. "You don't understand what it costs sometimes." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes looked glassy now. Every room, every conversation, every assumption. She pressed one hand lightly against her forehead. "I spend so much energy making other people comfortable." Mark moved closer carefully. "You don't have to do that with me." Keisha looked at him immediately. "But I already am." Silence. Realization hit him slowly then. Not because she doubted his love, because she still monitored his reactions emotionally, still softened herself carefully, still carried responsibility inside conversations meant to support her too. And honestly, that broke something inside him. Mark rubbed his face slowly. "I don't know how to fix this." Keisha's expression softened slightly hearing that, because finally, he stopped defending himself long enough to admit uncertainty. But damage already sat between them now, and both of them felt it. Mark sat down heavily on the edge of the couch. "I hate feeling like I'm failing you." Keisha stayed near the window quietly. "You're not failing me. Then why does this feel so bad?" Her answer came almost immediately. "Because we're finally talking about real things." That truth settled heavily through the apartment. No raised voices, no dramatic screaming, just two people realizing love alone didn't automatically solve emotional differences. Mark looked toward her carefully. "I don't want you carrying everything alone." "I know." "Then help me." Keisha swallowed once, then finally admitted something she clearly hated saying out loud. "I don't always know how." That hurt him too, because Keisha usually sounded emotionally certain about everything. Hearing confusion in her voice felt unfamiliar, human. Painfully human. Mark stood slowly and walked toward her, close enough now to reach for her hand. This time, she stepped back first. Small movement, huge impact. Mark froze instantly. Keisha looked devastated the second she realized she did it. "That's not what I meant, I know." But his voice sounded quieter now, more fragile. And suddenly fear entered the room fully for the first time. Not fear of fighting, fear of losing each other. Keisha looked down immediately. Tears finally slipped loose, despite her trying to hold them back. Mark's chest tightened painfully seeing it. He moved toward her again instinctively, but she shook her head gently. "I can't do this tonight." Those words nearly crushed him. "Keisha, please. I need space. Not punishment, not manipulation. Need, real emotional need." Mark stared at her for several seconds without speaking. Because suddenly the apartment didn't feel safe anymore. It felt temporary. And that terrified him. Keisha wiped quickly beneath her eyes before grabbing her keys from the kitchen counter. Mark frowned immediately. "Where are you going?" "Driving." "At this hour?" "I just need air." "Keisha, I can't breathe in this conversation anymore." That sentence hit him hardest of all. Because, for the first time since meeting her, Mark realized love alone might not be enough to keep her beside him. Keisha walked toward the apartment door slowly, then paused briefly without turning around, and quietly she said, "I don't want to become exhausted inside my own relationship too." Then she walked out, leaving Mark standing alone inside the apartment, finally understanding he might actually lose her. Mark didn't sleep. Not really. He sat awake most of the night inside his condo staring at Chicago through the giant windows while traffic moved far below like distant waves of light. The apartment felt wrong without hearing Keisha's voice somewhere inside it. Too clean, too quiet, too empty. Around 3 a.m, he replayed the argument again. Not just the words, the moments between the words, the way she stepped back when he reached for her, the tears she tried hiding, the exhaustion in her voice when she said, "I can't breathe in this conversation anymore." That part stayed with him most, because suddenly, he understood something terrifying. Keisha wasn't afraid of conflict. She was afraid of emotional loneliness. And, somehow, despite loving her completely, he still made her feel alone sometimes. By sunrise, Mark looked exhausted. His tie sat loose around his collar, while untouched coffee cooled near the kitchen counter. Still, he went to work, because people like Mark learned early that pain didn't pause responsibility. Blackridge Financial looked exactly the same the next morning. Elevators crowded, meetings scheduled, employees rushing through hallways, but everything felt different to him now. For the first time in years, he walked into the office, unable to control his thoughts. He barely noticed people greeting him, barely noticed assistants handing him reports. His mind stayed with Keisha, alone, crying, emotionally exhausted because of him. Around noon, Mark stepped into an executive elevator, intending to escape another strategy meeting he couldn't focus through, but before the doors closed completely, a hand stopped them. The founder stepped inside calmly. Mark straightened automatically. "Sir." The older man glanced at him once. "You look terrible." Normally, Mark would have laughed politely. Today, he didn't. The founder studied him carefully. "That serious?" Mark leaned back against the elevator wall slowly. "I think I hurt her." Silence. Not awkward. Measured. The founder nodded once, like he already suspected that answer. "Keisha." Mark swallowed slightly. She asked for space. The elevator continued climbing quietly. Then the founder asked something unexpected. "Did you listen?" Mark frowned. "What?" "When she was hurting. Did you listen?" Mark opened his mouth immediately, then stopped, because, honestly, not enough. The founder saw realization hit his face slowly. He murmured softly. That tiny sound carried more understanding than judgment. Mark rubbed one hand over his jaw tiredly. "I was trying to fix things." "That's not what I asked." The elevator doors opened onto a private executive floor, rarely used anymore. The founder stepped out slowly, then motioned for Mark to follow him. Inside the private office overlooking downtown Chicago, sunlight stretched across dark wooden shelves lined with awards and photographs collected across decades. The founder removed his jacket calmly before sitting near the windows. Mark remained standing awkwardly for a second, then finally sat too. The older man studied him quietly. "You love her?" Mark answered immediately. "Yes." No hesitation, no uncertainty. The founder nodded once, like he expected that too. "Then stop making love about your intentions." Mark looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means loving someone isn't only about what you mean." Silence. The founder folded his hands together thoughtfully. Keisha has spent most of her life carrying herself carefully through rooms that questioned her value before she even spoke. Mark lowered his eyes briefly. "She told me." "No," the founder corrected softly. "She explained it to you." That distinction mattered. And suddenly, Mark understood why. Because hearing something intellectually wasn't the same as emotionally understanding the weight of it. The founder continued calmly. "You know why she's graceful?" Mark stayed quiet. "Because she had to become graceful very early." That sentence settled heavily between them. The founder looked toward the city outside. She learned young that anger frightened people more than disrespect disappointed them. Mark felt his chest tighten hearing that. So she learned control, discipline, restraint. Another pause. But people confuse graceful women with women who aren't tired. Mark looked down slowly, because suddenly, he saw the full picture. Keisha wasn't asking him to solve racism, or office gossip, or public assumptions. She simply needed one place emotionally safe enough to stop carrying herself so carefully, and during their argument, he accidentally made her carry him too. The founder leaned back quietly. "You know the strongest thing about Keisha?" Mark looked up. "She still believes people can become better." Silence. The founder smiled faintly. "That's why she gave you another chance after the lobby." Mark's throat tightened slightly, because he remembered it clearly now. Her disappointment, her restraint, her decision to stay kind even after humiliation. The founder pointed toward him gently. But love requires humility, Mark. Not control, not protection. Humility. The ability to sit inside somebody else's pain without immediately making yourself the center of the conversation. Mark leaned forward slowly, elbows against his knees. I don't want to lose her. The founder nodded calmly. Then stop approaching this like an executive solving a problem. Mark looked over tiredly. What should I do? The older man smiled slightly. Go listen. That afternoon, Chicago felt unusually quiet to Mark. Or maybe his thoughts were simply louder. By evening, he stood outside Keisha's apartment building again. No flowers, no dramatic speech prepared, no grand gesture, just honesty. The hallway outside her apartment looked exactly the same as the night before. But this time, Mark breathed slower before knocking. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened carefully. Keisha looked tired, not angry anymore, just emotionally drained. For a second, neither spoke. Then Mark said softly, I listened. Her expression shifted slightly. Not fully, just enough. Mark kept his voice calm. I spent the whole night realizing you weren't asking me to defend myself less. Keisha stayed quiet. You were asking me to carry your pain with you, instead of arguing my way out of feeling uncomfortable. Silence. Mark looked down briefly before continuing. And I didn't do that well. Keisha's eyes softened slightly, hearing him admit it plainly. No excuses, no defense, no, but just accountability. Mark finally looked back up at her. I'm still learning. Her voice came quietly now. I know, and I'm gonna mess things up sometimes. A tiny, tired smile touched her face. I know that too. Mark stepped slightly closer. Careful, intentional. I just never want you feeling emotionally alone beside me. That one hit her deeply. He could see it immediately. Because, finally, he understood the real issue. Keisha lowered her eyes briefly before speaking. You really listened this time. Mark nodded slowly. Yes. The silence between them no longer felt sharp now. Still fragile, but softer. Keisha finally stepped aside from the doorway quietly. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just enough space for him to come inside again. And honestly, that small gesture meant more to Mark than forgiveness itself. Because, slowly, carefully, Keisha was choosing to trust him again. By autumn, Chicago carried a different kind of beauty. The air turned sharper. Trees along downtown sidewalks burned orange and gold beneath early morning sunlight, while cold wind rushed between skyscrapers again. But this time, life felt different for Mark. Not easier, just clearer. The last few months changed both of them quietly, not into perfect people, into more honest ones. Arguments still happened sometimes. Stress still followed them home occasionally. Blackridge still carried politics and ego inside every executive floor. But now, they faced things together, instead of accidentally standing against each other. That mattered. More than either of them realized at first. Friday morning arrived with the biggest Blackridge expansion announcement in company history. Press interviews, investors, major city partnerships. Everything the company spent months preparing for had finally reached its final stage. And for the first time, Mark felt calm walking into it. Not because the pressure disappeared, because Keisha walked beside him. The Blackridge Tower rose above downtown Chicago, exactly the way it had the morning they first met. Cold glass, gold lettering, corporate confidence. But now, the building looked different to Mark somehow. Or maybe he was simply seeing it honestly for the first time. Keisha adjusted the sleeve of her coat beside him, while they approached the entrance together. You nervous? She asked casually. Mark smirked slightly. Little bit. That's healthy. You sound like my therapist. You should probably get one. He laughed quietly while holding the door open for her. The second they stepped into the lobby, memory hit him immediately. Same marble floors, same reception desk, same elevator doors reflecting morning light across the room. For a second, Mark stopped walking completely. Keisha noticed instantly. What? His eyes moved slowly across the lobby. This place used to feel normal to me. Keisha followed his gaze quietly. Employees rushed through security checkpoints nearby, while executives crossed the floor carrying coffee and expensive stress exactly like before, but something had changed. People greeted Keisha warmly now, respectfully, not performatively either. Genuinely. One assistant smiled brightly passing by. "Morning, Keisha, morning." Another executive nodded respectfully toward her while holding the elevator. Nobody questioned her presence anymore. Nobody looked confused seeing her there. Funny how quickly people adjusted once somebody's value became undeniable publicly. Mark shook his head slightly. "What?" He looked at her quietly. "I was horrible to you here." Keisha sighed softly. "We've already had this conversation." "I know." But his eyes remained fixed on the lobby. The exact spot near the reception desk where she stood months ago flashed through his memory clearly. The assumptions, the arrogance, the confidence he once carried without questioning himself. Mark laughed once under his breath. "What? I really thought I knew people." Keisha smiled faintly. "You thought you understood environments." That answer sat differently, because she was right. Mark used to believe success made him perceptive. Now he understood something far more uncomfortable. Power often protected people from realizing how little they actually noticed. They moved toward the elevators slowly together. Mark pressed the private elevator button automatically, and suddenly another memory hit him. The elevator apology. Keisha saying, "You get tired of fighting people just to exist comfortably in certain spaces." That sentence never left him, probably never would. The elevator doors opened softly. They stepped inside together. Same elevator. Same jazz music overhead. Same mirrored walls. But completely different people standing inside now. Mark loosened his tie slightly while staring ahead. "You know something strange?" Keisha leaned lightly against the railing. "What? If you never walked into this building that morning." He paused briefly. "I probably would have stayed the same person forever." Keisha looked at him quietly. Mark's expression tightened slightly. "I could have stayed that man." The words came out heavier than he expected, because now he fully understood what he meant. He could have stayed arrogant, emotionally disconnected, observant only toward things benefiting him directly, successful but empty. And honestly, that thought scared him. Keisha studied him carefully for a second, then stepped closer slowly. Not dramatic, just close enough for warmth. Mark looked down at her, and softly she answered, "But you didn't." Simple words, huge meaning. The elevator continued rising quietly while Mark held her gaze. And suddenly, he realized something important. Keisha never changed him by forcing him to become different. She changed him by refusing to become smaller around him. That difference mattered deeply. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where employees already prepared for the expansion event. Large presentation screens glowed across conference rooms, while assistants moved quickly organizing final reports. The founder stood near the windows speaking with investors before noticing them arrive together. A faint smile crossed his face immediately. "Well," he said calmly, "looks like both of you survived each other." Keisha laughed softly. "Barely." Mark smiled too. And honestly, hearing her laugh inside this building still felt surreal sometimes. Because months ago, this place represented humiliation between them. Now, it represented growth, healing, partnership. The founder approached them slowly, then looked toward Mark, carefully. "You look different." Mark glanced down at himself. "I'm still wearing a suit." "That's not what I meant." The older man's eyes shifted toward Keisha briefly before returning to him. "You listen now." Silence. Mark smiled faintly. "Working on it." Keisha folded her arms playfully, very slowly. "I'm improving." The founder chuckled quietly, watching both of them. And for the first time since walking into Blackridge that morning months ago, Keisha felt fully comfortable standing inside this building, not because the company changed completely, because she no longer carried herself like somebody waiting to be questioned. And Mark? He no longer stood beside her, trying to protect his image. He stood beside her as a man finally learning what respect actually looked like. Outside the conference room windows, downtown Chicago stretched endlessly beneath bright autumn sunlight, and somehow, the city no longer felt cold anymore. The expansion event ended better than anyone expected. Investors applauded. Executives shook hands too hard, trying to look confident for cameras. Reporters crowded near conference entrances asking questions about Chicago growth projections, while Blackridge employees moved through the building carrying the relieved exhaustion that came after months of pressure finally paid off. But honestly, Mark barely cared about any of it anymore. Not the cameras, not the headlines, not even the praise. Because across the crowded executive floor, Keisha stood near the windows laughing softly at something the founder whispered to her. And somehow, that mattered more than every business victory combined. Mark watched her quietly for a second too long. Keisha noticed immediately. There you go again. Mark walked closer. What? That staring thing. I'm appreciating. That line getting expensive now. He laughed softly. Some things never changed between them. Thank God. The founder adjusted his cufflinks nearby before glancing toward Mark knowingly. You planning to tell her tonight? Keisha frowned immediately. Tell me what? Mark nearly choked. The founder smiled calmly. Nothing. Keisha looked suspicious instantly. Why do older people always say nothing right before chaos? Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I'm starting to dislike him a little. Good. The founder replied smoothly. Keeps you humble. Keisha narrowed her eyes at both of them. I don't trust either one of you right now. That made Mark laugh harder than he expected. And suddenly he realized something important again. Peace, real peace. Not the absence of problems, the presence of somebody who still made life feel lighter during stressful seasons. Later that evening, Chicago shimmered beneath cold blue light while Mark drove slowly along Lakeshore Drive. Keisha sat beside him quietly watching the city pass through the windows. You've been weird all day, she said finally. Mark kept his eyes on the road. That's aggressive. It's accurate. He smiled slightly. You always this observant? You taught me to pay attention. That answer stayed with him, because she was right. They changed each other, not through force, through honesty. Mark parked near the lakefront, without speaking immediately. Waves moved quietly against the shoreline beneath distant city lights, while cold wind swept across the water. Keisha stepped out first, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Oh wow, she said softly. It's freezing. You say that every year. Because Chicago keeps trying to kill us every winter. Mark laughed under his breath while walking beside her. The lake stretched endlessly dark beneath the night sky, while downtown glowed behind them like scattered gold. For a while, they simply walked. No pressure, no heavy conversation, just footsteps against pavement and wind brushing through their coats. Keisha slipped her hand naturally into his. Mark looked down briefly at their fingers together. Still surreal sometimes. Months ago, she barely trusted him inside a lobby. Now she reached for him instinctively. Life moved strangely. You okay? She asked quietly. Mark exhaled slowly. Yeah, that sounded fake. He smiled, little nervous. Keisha stopped walking immediately. Nervous? Mark looked toward the water briefly, then back at her. There's something I need to say. Her expression changed instantly. Not panic, just attention, complete attention. And suddenly, Mark realized something funny. Public speaking never scared him. Boardrooms never scared him. Billion-dollar negotiations never scared him. But standing here beside Keisha, heart racing like this, terrifying. He laughed softly at himself once. Keisha squeezed his hand gently. Mark, he looked at her, and for a second, everything slowed down naturally. The city noise, the wind, even his thoughts, because the truth became painfully simple in that moment. He loved this woman. Not carefully, not conditionally, completely. Mark stepped closer slowly. Keisha, before you walked into Blackridge that morning. He smiled faintly. I honestly thought I understood success. Her eyes softened immediately. But you changed everything. Keisha shook her head gently. No. You changed yourself. Maybe, he admitted quietly. But you made me want to. That emotion appeared in her face again, the one she always tried hiding when something touched her deeply. Mark continued softly. You taught me how to listen, how to slow down, how to care about people correctly. He laughed quietly through nervousness, and apparently how to stop buying $90 salads. Keisha covered her mouth laughing immediately. That story follows you forever. Worth it. Then his expression softened again. I spent most of my life chasing achievement. His thumb brushed lightly against her hand. But being loved by you. Pause. That's the first thing that ever made me feel like I already had enough. Keisha's eyes watered instantly. Mark saw it. So did she. Oh no, she whispered emotionally. You're doing the voice. What voice? That emotional voice people use before ruining somebody's makeup. Mark laughed softly, then slowly. He lowered himself onto one knee. Keisha froze completely. Both hands flew to her face immediately. No, she whispered. Yes. Oh my God. The wind moved harder off the lake, while city lights reflected behind them beautifully across dark water. But nothing about the moment felt staged. No crowd watching, no cameras, no dramatic performance. Just truth. Mark looked up at her carefully. You were graceful with me before I deserved it. Keisha wiped quickly beneath her eyes. You challenged me. You humbled me. And somehow, he smiled softly. You still loved me anyway. Her shoulders shook slightly, trying not to cry harder. Mark reached into his coat slowly. I don't want a life where you aren't beside me. Then quietly, Keisha, marry me. The tears came immediately after that. Real tears. Not polished movie tears. The kind people can't control. Keisha laughed through them, while shaking her head repeatedly. You really did all this by the lake. You hate public attention. That's true. And if I proposed in a restaurant, your church mothers would have turned it into a conference. She laughed harder, covering her face. Oh my God. Mark smiled, watching her. And suddenly something relaxed inside him too, because before she even answered, he already knew. Keisha stepped closer slowly, tears still falling while looking down at him. Yes. Mark blinked once. Yes? Yes, Mark. That was enough. He stood immediately and pulled her into him while she laughed against his chest, still crying at the same time. And honestly, neither of them cared how ridiculous they looked standing near freezing water hugging each other like the rest of Chicago disappeared. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Later that night, Keisha sat curled against him inside her apartment, while calling family members one after another, screaming, crying, laughing. At one point, Mark heard somebody yell loudly through speakerphone. He finally did it. Keisha buried her face against his shoulder, laughing hard. I can't stand my family. You absolutely love your family. That's different. Hours later, after the calls finally slowed down and the apartment grew quieter again, Mark sat beside her on the couch, watching her stare down at the ring absent-mindedly. You happy? He asked softly. Keisha looked up slowly, then smiled in a way he knew he'd remember forever. Yeah, she whispered. Outside, Chicago wind moved softly against the apartment windows while the city settled deeper into night. And somewhere across town, morning slowly waited for the day Keisha would become his wife. The wedding morning arrived quietly, not peacefully, quietly, because both families had already turned the hotel into organized chaos before sunrise. Keisha stood near the mirror inside the bridal suite, while somebody knocked on the door for the 4th time in 10 minutes. If nobody answers me, a voice shouted from the hallway. I'm coming in anyway. Keisha covered her face, laughing. There they go. Across the room, makeup brushes, curling irons, shoes, and half-opened garment bags covered nearly every surface. Her phone buzzed constantly beside the vanity. Family members, church members, cousins sending dramatic voice notes. At one point, somebody accidentally sent a 3-minute prayer instead of a text. Keisha listened to half of it before laughing too hard to continue. But underneath all the noise, emotion sat heavily in her chest. Not nervousness exactly. Something softer, bigger. The kind of feeling that appears when life changes permanently, in a good way. Miss Loretta stepped into the room carrying food containers immediately after another knock. Nobody getting married hungry. Keisha laughed instantly. You brought fried chicken to a wedding suite? I brought wisdom. That answer nearly ruined everybody's makeup from laughing. Miss Loretta placed the containers down before walking closer toward Keisha slowly. Then her expression softened completely. Well now. Keisha looked up, and suddenly, The room became emotional. Because for a second, nobody saw the successful investor. Nobody saw the poised woman from Blackridge. They just saw Keisha, the little girl who worked too hard too early, the woman who carried herself through life carefully, while still staying kind. Miss Loretta touched her cheek gently. "You happy, baby?" Keisha's eyes filled immediately. "Yeah." Miss Loretta smiled softly. "Good." Across town, Mark adjusted his tie for the 5th time, while staring at himself inside the hotel mirror. "You're making the tie nervous," the founder said calmly from the couch. Mark exhaled sharply. "I'm fine." "No, you're not." Mark looked over. The founder smirked slightly. "You've checked your watch 11 times in 6 minutes. That feels exaggerated." "It's not." Mark laughed quietly before sitting heavily near the edge of the bed. The founder studied him carefully. "Nervous?" Mark thought about lying. Didn't. "Terrified." "Good. That's comforting." "It should be." The founder leaned back comfortably. Men should feel the weight of marrying a woman like Keisha. That answer settled deeply inside Mark immediately, because he understood exactly what the older man meant. Keisha wasn't simply beautiful, or intelligent, or accomplished. She was emotionally rare, the kind of person who stayed graceful without becoming weak, the kind who kept dignity without losing warmth, the kind who made people better if they listened carefully enough. Mark smiled faintly to himself. Still feels crazy sometimes. What does? That she even gave me another chance after the lobby. The founder laughed softly under his breath. "Well, to be fair." Mark looked over. "You really were terrible." Mark groaned immediately. "Thank you for the support." "I'm serious." The founder shook his head, smiling. "You looked at that woman and saw everything except who she actually was." Silence. Then the older man's expression softened. "But the important part?" Mark waited. "You learned." That mattered most. Not perfection. Growth. Outside the wedding venue, autumn sunlight stretched warmly across downtown Chicago, while guests slowly filled the ceremony space. Music floated softly through hidden speakers, while people greeted each other with hugs, laughter, and emotional energy that kept growing every minute. Mark stood near the front, trying unsuccessfully to look calm. His hands betrayed him completely. The founder noticed immediately. "Stop flexing your fingers like you're preparing for combat." Mark laughed nervously. "I can't help it." Then, the music changed. Everything shifted instantly. Guests stood slowly. Conversations disappeared, and Mark looked toward the entrance. The breath left his body completely. Keisha. For a second, nothing else existed. Not the guests, not the music, not even the city outside. Just her. She moved slowly down the aisle with tears already shining in her eyes, while soft light caught the details of her dress beautifully. And suddenly, Mark remembered the first time he saw her. The lobby, the assumptions, the arrogance. "You've got 45 minutes to leave." God, what a terrible man he almost stayed. Keisha reached the front finally. Mark looked at her, like he still couldn't fully believe she chose him. Keisha noticed immediately. "What?" She whispered softly. "You're beautiful." "You already said that." I panicked. I needed to repeat it. That made her laugh quietly through tears. And somehow hearing that laugh relaxed him instantly. The ceremony itself felt real in the best possible way. Not overly polished, not performative, real. At one point, Mark stumbled slightly over part of his vows, because emotion caught him off guard. Keisha squeezed his hands gently while smiling through tears. "You good?" She whispered quietly. "Barely." She laughed softly again. And honestly, that moment felt more perfect than flawless vows ever could. By the reception, both families blended together naturally, in ways nobody could have predicted months earlier. Keisha's side brought loud joy, music, dancing, people yelling across tables mid-conversation. Mark's side started quieter, more reserved, but slowly. They loosened too, especially after Miss Loretta forced half the executives onto the dance floor against their will. The founder watched the reception carefully from a nearby table, while Mark approached holding 2 glasses. "You smiling like that because I survived dancing?" The founder accepted one drink calmly. "No." "Then what?" He nodded subtly toward Keisha, laughing across the room with family nearby. You almost lost her before you even met her. Mark looked toward her quietly. I know. And now look at you. Mark smiled faintly, because honestly, the older man was right. Months ago, Mark measured life through status and achievement. Now, the most important thing in the room sat laughing beneath warm reception lights wearing a wedding ring with his name attached to it. And somehow that meant more than every professional accomplishment combined. Across the room, Keisha caught him staring again. There he go. She called out laughing. Guests nearby laughed too. Mark pointed toward himself innocently. I'm married now. I can stare legally. Keisha covered her face, laughing harder. And suddenly, the room felt lighter again. Warmer. Safer. Later that night, long after speeches ended and music softened, Mark and Keisha stood alone briefly near the reception windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The city glowed quietly beneath them. Same city, same streets, same skyline, but completely different people now. Keisha leaned gently against him, while both watched traffic move below. Mark looked toward her carefully. You know something? What? That sentence still haunts me. Keisha smiled knowingly. 45 minutes? Mark shook his head slowly. I really looked at you and thought you didn't belong here. Keisha looked up at him softly. And now? Mark glanced around the reception. Their families, their friends, their life, then back at her. Now I think you were the only person who belonged in every room the entire time. Emotion filled her face immediately after that. Real emotion. The kind words create only when they're fully earned. Keisha rested her forehead lightly against his chest while music drifted quietly around them. And maybe that was the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes people become so obsessed with status that they stop recognizing character. Sometimes success teaches people how to judge quickly instead of listening carefully. And sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who stays kind after being underestimated repeatedly. Keisha never needed revenge. Never needed humiliation, never needed to destroy anybody publicly to prove her worth. Her dignity spoke loudly enough already. And Mark? He finally learned something far more valuable than power. Respect is not proven by how you treat important people. It's proven by how you treat people before knowing their importance. Because character reveals itself most clearly in moments where nobody important seems to be watching. Or at least when you think nobody important is watching.